All right, and since I know we have a lot to cover today, we have an hour to talk about a very complicated topic that we could probably go on for a weekend-long seminar, or we could get a degree in this topic like some folks have. Just really wanted to welcome everyone to the What is Zoning webinar hosted by Uptown United. For those of you who don't know us, Uptown United is a nonprofit economic development organization that serves Chicago's beautiful Uptown neighborhood. Along with the Chamber of Commerce, we have a mission to build a strong, unified business environment, facilitate economic development, and strengthen community, all to nurture a diverse, vibrant, and strong Uptown. Today's webinar is the second in a four-part series about topics in urban real estate and development issues. And the goal is to educate community members about some complicated topics that shape the future of our community. So our first webinar, which we hosted a few months ago, which was all about a really important topic, affordable housing. And you can find a link to that webinar on our website at exploreuptown.org, which is where this one will be posted in the future. As we kick things off, I also want to thank some of our annual sponsors who make our work in the neighborhood possible. Our two gold sponsors, Thoric Hospital and Weiss Hospital, our silver sponsor, Graceland Cemetery, and our bronze sponsor, Wintrust Bank. So thanks to them for being great community partners. And then most of all, I want to thank our really incredible lineup of panelists here with us today for taking time out of their busy schedules to share with us. So with that, I'm going to pass it off. I'm going to ask the panelists to just quickly introduce themselves to the folks who are joining us today. So I will kick things off with our moderator, Jackson.
Thank you, Martin. I'm Jackson Morsey. I'm an urban planner with UIC Great Cities Institute. We do a lot of community revitalization and corridor planning processes, mostly on the south and west sides of the city. But I am an Uptown resident, and I serve on the Development Partners Committee of Uptown United, which has experts in architecture, urban planning, affordable housing that reviews developments within the Uptown community in an effort to improve them and make sure that they are a good fit for our community.
Great, thanks, Jackson. Stephen?
Hi, my name is Stephen Vance. I am the CEO and founder of Chicago Cityscape, which is a real estate information platform for brokers, for developers, for zoning attorneys, as well as there's a lot of features for residents to see what's going on in their neighborhood.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And we use your platform, and it is great. Teresa?
Good evening, everyone. I hear nothing but great things about Uptown United, so it's a real honor to be here with you this evening. Thank you very much. Look forward to the conversation. Oh, I'm director of Great Cities Institute at UIC, and I'm also chair of the Chicago Plan Commission.
Hey, Christina?
Hi, everyone. Glad to join you tonight. I'm Christina Harris, Director of Land Use and Planning at the Metropolitan Planning Council. MPC is a nonprofit planning and policy organization that was founded in 1934 with a focus on creating a more equitable, sustainable, prosperous, and civically engaged Chicago region. My work at the organization focuses on policy advocacy to help create thriving and vibrant communities with equitable access to land uses like retail, open space, affordable housing, and transportation. I am also an Uptown resident as well, so I'm very happy to be here tonight.
Great, thank you, Christina. Patrick?
Hi, yes, my name is Patrick Murphey. I'm the zoning administrator in the city's Department of Planning and Development. Our staff, it's 29 individuals, and we're in charge with enforcing, interpreting, applying the zoning ordinance to every permit that's submitted to the city. So for new construction, landscaping, parking lots, we apply the zoning codes as far as impacting how the built environment is shaped, and as well as the uses that are allowed in our neighborhoods. Thank you, Martin.
Great, thank you, Patrick. So how our event is going to work tonight is Patrick is going to give a little overview on zoning in Chicago, and then I'm going to pass it off to Jackson, who's going to moderate a Q&A with our panel here. If you have a question along the way, feel free to type it into the Q&A feature, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. And with that, I will pass it over to Patrick.
Okay, thank you. Give me 2 seconds and I will pull up the PowerPoint. Hold on 2 seconds.
All right, can everyone see that? Cool, Patrick,
Yes.
just let me know when
Thank
you
you.
want me to advance the slide.
Okay, go right ahead. Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so what I'll do over these next 20 or so slides, and I will go through them quickly, and I'm sorry for the time loss already, is basically lay out the structure of the zoning bureau in the zoning department and walk through on a high level what the different zoning designations mean, what can be done there, and then we can talk about how zoning map amendments and different projects can be processed through city council committees and departmental staff. So this page simply lays out the different structure of our department as far as what we oversee. So like I said before, we administer the zoning code. So those are the zoning regulations throughout the city. And we also staff the individuals who both process and review the applications that come before the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Chicago Plan Commission. There's a variety of projects. I won't go into those specifics. I'll touch on some of that later, but these are avenues essentially through the Zoning Ordinance Administration, where projects are done by right, generally speaking. And then the Zoning Board of Appeals or the Plan Commission have some additional legislative process, depending on the type of project, its scope, its intensity, its use, things of that nature. You can go to the next slide. So here is just essentially talks about how the zoning code is broken out. There are two main elements. I'll touch on how to find more information on those in the next couple of slides, but there's the zoning text itself. So that's the actual ordinance, the written words. And then there is a zoning map, which gives visual depictions to where different zoning designations are throughout the city. It also includes a host of other information related to the CTA, related to overlay districts that we've created, related to historic preservation. It is a large database of information that can be seen visually, and you can find out very specific information about your property or some other property that you're interested in. And you can go on to the next slide. So this just gives a very brief snapshot of what the zoning map looks like. So if you were to open up a link to the zoning map, click on a piece of property, the information bar on the left-hand side would give you whatever relevant data exists for that piece of property. This is useful in we use it every day, all day long. The general public has full access to it, and it's continually updated every month as new zoning map amendments are passed by city council, or if new text amendments are passed, which regulate some of the elements of the zoning map. You can go on to the next page. So this is a snapshot of the online version of the municipal code and the zoning chapters themselves. There are 17 chapters within the zoning portion of the municipal code, and those regulate everything from land use. They provide definitional information, signage, landscaping, parking, and I'll run through some of those highlights in the next few slides. You can go on. So for those that aren't familiar, this is just a very brief depiction of what zoning designations mean. So the letters in the front, in this case DX, stand for downtown mixed use. Those give you the type of classification. You'll see business, you'll see residential, manufacturing. Then the numbers that come after that, in this case -5, relate to either the types of things you can do, and I'll get into that a little later, or the amount of intensity from a building bulk standpoint. So a -5, that represents floor area, and that means you have 5 times the amount of site area to build the bulk of your building. If you have a 1,000 square foot parcel of land with -5 zoning, putting all other zoning regulations aside, that means you can build a 5,000 square foot building. Now, there are a lot of things that would impinge on that, but that's generally what the numbers and letters translate to. You can go on. So this just breaks out a little bit more of the floor area that I was just talking about in the net side area. You can skip. So now we're going to get into the designations that you'll find in the neighborhoods and then in downtown. And I'll show later on a map, the downtown zoning is its own specific boundary and it's defined in the municipal code. It's not adjustable, but by a very specific action by city council. So in the case of residential properties, things with an R zone, and I'll get to the different districts on the next slide, these are the typical uses that we will find. And the one thing to note is there is an absolute restriction on industrial use and an overwhelming restriction on business and commercial uses. These are the areas for residential properties, single family homes up to high rises you see along the lakefront. And there's a very specific effort on our part to keep the business and commercial and industrial uses out of the residential neighborhoods. You can go on. This slide just highlights the types of residential zoning we have. RS stands for the single unit detached house districts. The RT is the transitional district that gets you up to the larger high rises that you will see, for instance, like along the lakefront. The RT district is where you'll find a predominant amount of your 3 to 6 flat buildings and townhomes. And then the RM districts are where you will generally see the tallest properties in our residential zoning district. They would be the most dense and the largest such buildings. You can go on. So here's our business and commercial designations. They're rather straightforward as far as what you can do there. The one thing to note, and you can see on the next few slides, is that as you transition from a B1 district to a B3 district or a C1 district to a C3 district, you will find a gradual intensification of the types of business and commercial uses you can do. You can go on to the next slide. The one unique aspect to the B zoning districts is the B2 district. That allows residential occupancy on the ground floor. And I guess said a little differently, it allows for non-commercial use on the ground floor, because in a lot of cases, a residential use won't necessarily mean a dwelling unit. It might mean the absence of any type of commercial activity. There would be no storefront shops. So that would not qualify under a B1 or a B3 district because there's no commercial component. If you go on to the next slide. The unique nature about the C districts, especially as you get to the C2 district, is your ability to start performing work operations outside. That's where you'll find landscape and contractor yards. That's where you will find the outdoor sales of vehicles. That's where you will find the slightly more intense, on the lowest scale, industrial uses. And the C3 district is where you will find a prohibition on residential use. C3 districts are what we generally use or encourage to use as a buffer between manufacturing areas and lower scale business or even residential areas. Because the idea we want to have is to not have an abrupt change from a manufacturing intensity to, say, a residential use where it's only divided by, in some cases, a 66-foot right-of-way, a general public street. You can go on to the next slide. Now, there's a lot of text on this slide regarding TSL. I won't go through all of it, but the idea is to show that there is currently a transit served location ordinance. And in general terminology, you'll hear people talk about TODs, transit oriented developments. The distinction that we're making here is our transit oriented developments can only be established in a transit served location. So the transit served location ordinance is very specific numerically to your distance from a CTA or metro train station or certain CTA bus lines. And that establishment of a transit served location allows for someone to then take advantage of the various other elements on this slide related to height, floor area. If you go to the next slide, you'll see parking reductions. All of those elements are incentives or premiums that we offer in transit served locations to try to encourage greater density, a larger step up of buildings, and encouraging less parking. And I can get into some of those details if there's specific questions about it after the other speakers. You can go on to the next slide. So the downtown zoning, like I mentioned, is a very specifically defined geography. I'll show it on a map in a couple of slides. There are, I should say, while rules related to density and building height, floor area are all the same, they are magnified in the downtown area. They are, the math that underlies these zoning districts downtown is the reason why you can see multi-hundred unit buildings. It's the reason why you can see 1,000-foot tall buildings. You can't get to those levels of development in the neighborhood zoning districts. That's not how the city has evolved over time. And that also would be very difficult to argue from a contextual standpoint, interjecting a downtown scale of development in a neighborhood that's many miles to the northwest or south. You can go on to the next slide. This breaks out the 4 different zoning designations for downtown. The definition of a downtown core is not only related to the use type, but it's also specifically defined in the zoning code. It doesn't exactly track with the loop, but generally speaking, it's going to be the area of the Chicago Loop. And the distinction that's made with the DX district, which is the other most predominant zoning designation downtown, is a greater flexibility towards residential and non-commercial uses. So the downtown core, if you can just visualize in your head, is where you're going to see a majority of the office buildings. In a downtown mixed district, you're going to start to see a blend of residential that gives more of a, you know, I guess in the way it's terminology now, a 24-hour life to areas of the city. Downtown residential is just like the R districts in the neighborhoods. So it's predominantly residential only, not commercially focused. And then the downtown S, the service district, is the equivalent, although on a very light scale, of manufacturing in the downtown area. And what that really translates to is essentially the area south of the Congress Expressway, west of the South Branch of the river, and east of the of 9094. That is a large pocket of industrial distribution, low scale warehouses. That's where a majority of our DS zoning is located. You can go on to the next slide. So there's a downtown floor area bonus, and I won't go too far into the details, although the next map will help explain some of the math behind it. The downtown floor area bonus was the current version we have now was established in 2016, and it allows for applicants to purchase floor area on a sliding scale that corresponds to the scale of their project and the size of their parcel, in order to provide a bigger building with more units, but also it directly leads to the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund that the mayor's office, both this administration and the last, have been using to take revenue generated by downtown projects and use those in commercial areas on the south and west side to try and spread out and make a more equitable development scale throughout the city. So the downtown bonus is only about 5 years old. It has resulted in over $300 million in monies that have been committed. And the difference is committed monies are those that are approved by city council. Actual payment of that money only comes at the time of permit. And we're about 40% of that is what has been paid so far. And then both the last administration and now have been rolling out through various applications and announcements the use of that money in the commercial areas on the south and west side. You can move on to the next slide. Here's the map I was referring to. The outermost boundaries on this map represent the extent of downtown zoning. And I mean, if you are across the street from downtown zoning, you are across the street. You are not in the downtown, because that is a question or an issue that comes up regularly, and we don't have the authority to extend those designations. And then the smaller indicators inside are how the neighborhood opportunity bonus is calculated. And without getting into too much, without getting too much history about it, the numbers that are there represent a 5-year rolling average of all property sales within those boundaries that were done for the redevelopment of property. So to put it another way, if you buy a piece of land that is a vacant building which is demolished, or a vacant piece of property, that is a sale that we would track for purposes of figuring out this calculation. However, if you buy an existing 3-story commercial and restaurant building that has tenants, or if you buy an existing 40-story high-rise that has residential or office occupancy, those are bought as investment properties that already have a stream of income. We exclude those for these purposes. And the reason we do that is because the calculations that we make for a floor area bonus are designed to value how much it costs to build one floor of a building, not counting having to worry about the foundational and mechanical equipment on the lower levels. In theory, you're buying bonus to build a taller building. You're adding it to the top. And so the value of those layers of the building is less than what it would cost if you were starting from the ground up. With a discount factor that we use for weighting these dollar amounts and weighting these sales, we then come up with the dollar per square foot, which is then calculated through a process of calculating floor area, and results in sometimes multi-million-dollar payments by applicants in order to take advantage of the bonus system. You can go on to the next slide. So now I'll touch briefly on our manufacturing districts. These are located throughout the city. They are a subset of those, which we'll get to later, are the planned manufacturing districts. But these are where you'll see the most intensive outdoor operations that we allow within the city. These would be where you would find recycling facilities. These are where you would find, in many cases, warehousing and distribution facilities. These are what we try to have an installation of them from the neighboring community, and we're in the midst of examining both our 26 industrial corridors as well as our 15 planned manufacturing districts in order to determine, are there uses we need to change? Are there boundaries we need to adjust? Are there different regulations we need to consider to be more in step with how manufacturing is evolving and how the city wants to evolve? You can go on to the next slide. So plan developments are what I was referring to earlier, that are one of the special types of projects that goes through the Chicago Plan Commission. In one word, they are projects that are too large or too intense to be accommodated under the regular rules of the zoning code that we've just gone through. They're usually very, very unique. There are, in many cases, elements of them that are not repeatable based on the lot size or the intensity of the project. And they take on a separate set of requirements in our review, as well as by the Plan Commission and the City Council. We can talk about some of those specifically if there are questions out there, but these are very unique zoning designations. There's only about 1,500 of them in the city, and they go through a special staff within our department that reviews them for a different, or I should say additional criteria than we would find for a regular zoning designation. You can go on to the next slide. Oh, and this just talks about some of the, another aspect of the plan developments. We can certainly talk about more details on this in the future, but you can skip that for the time being. The Lakefront Protection Ordinance. This regulates what can be built, not from a land use standpoint, but from a functionality standpoint, along a less than even boundary along Lake Michigan. It runs from the Evanston border to the Indiana border, and it regulates how development should take place along the lakefront. It's also under the purview of the Chicago Plan Commission, and it is not subject to review. Projects that are subject to the Lakefront Protection Ordinance are not subject to review by the Chicago City Council. So the Chicago Plan Commission is the final deciding voice on things subject to the Lakefront Protection Ordinance. We are currently working with a version of that ordinance from 1972, and we have been working on a revision to that, although that has been somewhat sidelined just by the presence of originally the Lucas Museum and then now the Obama Center being located within the Lakefront Protection Ordinance. So while we're working on concluding, in this case, the Obama Center, we will hopefully be able to work on revisions to the Lakefront Protection Ordinance in the coming years. And then this is the last aspect of the slides. This just highlights some of the other elements that we deal with from a zoning standpoint. They don't necessarily have as much detail as I had gone through, but there are certain elements that we review or that we review projects under, and they have sometimes a lesser degree of impact on the citywide scale. They're usually more specific to defined geographies. And that's all. Thank you, Martin. I'm very sorry about that delay.
Thank you, Patrick. That was a great coverage of the basics of zoning within Chicago. Before we open up to the full panel to have a more general discussion about zoning, I wanted to throw it to Teresa Córdova, who is our chair of the Chicago Plan Commission. And since Patrick just talked about the plan developments and Lakefront Protection Ordinance, which falls under the Chicago Plan Commission, what is the role of the Chicago Plan Commission? How do you make decisions? And it should be noted that the Lakefront Protection Ordinance covers roughly a third of Uptown, all the land generally east of Sheridan Road within Uptown. So what's the decision-making and the thought process of the Chicago Plan Commission when it makes decisions on properties within that zone?
Thank you very much, Jackson. And thank you, Patrick. As you all can see, Patrick has to be aware of a great deal of very detailed and very specific information. And so There's a lot of times we turn to Patrick and say, now, Patrick, what's the particulars on that? But I'm always amazed at how much detail and how much specific information is there. So, but the Plan Commission, as Patrick pointed out, is under its purview is, first of all, those lands within a certain boundary of the lakefront all the way down, as he said. So, and it's under the Lakefront Protection Ordinance, and then the plan development. So your question, which is something Patrick pointed out, so your question was, how do we make those decisions? So what I thought I would do is real quickly, I happen just maybe to anticipate that question, but I just posted right now to everyone. This is the development manual that the plan commissioners use. Now I will tell you that that this has not been updated. It will be updated, and there's something really important that is not included yet in this update, which is some work that we did. Well, when I say we, it was initiated by us, the Plan Commission, in particular by me, but from the Plan Commission to the planning staff, and then they came back a couple of times, and then finally, with our approval, some new procedures on that will be soon added to this manual that I just submitted to you. And I'll talk either now or maybe in a bit on the particulars of what those changes are. But you'll see when you look at that manual the kinds of things that we have to take into account when we're making a decision. And so there are things that it's a land use decision. So we have to look at land use considerations. And that may be everything from looking at, for example, some of the things that Patrick pointed out to you, for example, floor area ratio. We look at, we'll get even into specifics around the building itself, its massing, its relationship to sidewalks, the issues around how it fits in with the overall neighborhood, for example. We'll look at we always look at ARO, the affordable housing requirement that's part of this. We'll look at issues around bulk and density and intensity. We always ask questions about transportation, traffic circulation. Parking is a big one that we take into account. Pedestrian orientation. In looking at the buildings themselves, for example, we might look at whether or not the building activates the street. We try to encourage that the street itself is activated. We try to discourage, for example, windowless walls. So there's a lot of those kinds of particulars that we'll look at in making a decision. The overall neighborhood context and so on, the overall design, how tall buildings should be, the high rises, where we encourage green design, whether or not there's open space that's incorporated into the project, landscaping and so on. What are some of the other amenities that are provided in that building? Things like drainage, what's their drainage system? That's something we'll take into consideration as well. So those kinds of criteria, we'll take into account. But one of the things that I think is important is also to ask the question, or for the community folks to ask the question, what is missing from that criteria? So for example, could that criteria be strengthened if we were to add more things about ways to assess the impact on the surrounding neighborhood? It would be strengthened if we looked, for example, at some of the other environmental considerations. And those kinds of things aren't really currently listed. To get them listed, it's something that I'd like to see done. It's one of the things I want to do in my role as chair, but it's going to be a process to get that done. And it's not something we as a plan commission can decide. We would work very closely with Patrick on that. It would have to go before the city council to make those kinds of additions or changes. But I think one of the things that's important about our abilities is because it's a land use decision, there might be a lot of other things that we might want to consider, but can't. We're limited in a certain sense. And we have to pay really close attention to to what the various zoning ordinances allow us to be able to consider. So there's more I could say, but I'll stop at that so we can get other panelists in here as well.
Thank you. So I wanted to bring Stephen and Christina in here as well, but feel free to jump in, Teresa or Patrick as well. How has zoning shaped Chicago through since zoning was first established in Chicago? Who makes these zoning decisions, and what kind of role does the community plans at the neighborhood level have in shaping some of those zoning and land use decisions?
Tina, do you want to go first?
I was going to let you kick it off and maybe add more about, I mean, it's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah.
Add more about, I think, the community input,
Okay,
especially as it relates to plan development.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that. Well, we can do that. So Chicago adopted its first zoning code in the 1910s, I believe. And then it's been revised a couple of times since then. So I think it was revised in the 40s, and then it was revised in 1957, and it was revised in 2004. And so what that means is that Chicago doesn't update its zoning code very often, because it's usually a big controversial exercise in city planning. And between 1957 and 2004, of course, there are small tweaks here and there that are made. For example, the planned manufacturing districts was added prior to the 2004 zoning code adoption. I think the Lakefront Protection District was added in the 1970s. And actually, I do have a map of that I just want to pull up so that people can see what we're talking about when we talk about this thing called the Lakefront Protection District. And you should see it now, right?
Yes.
So what Teresa was saying was that for changes, new buildings, large revisions to buildings that are within that darker blue area on the east third of Uptown community area, and also north and south of Uptown, those goes through a different review process to ensure that Lake Michigan is protected from pollution and traffic and just things that you don't really want near a beautiful lakefront. And then as far as like changing the zoning code, well, so that's where I think Christina can talk, because the organization she works for was actually one of the major consultants for the 2004 zoning code rewrite. But yeah, so go ahead, Christina.
I'd like to preface that with saying that was before my time. I was not there in 2004. But so I would say one of the zoning code isn't updated very often, but there are currently planning processes that have been in process to think about how zoning changes should occur. Patrick mentioned one of them, the industrial corridor modernization process, which is currently ongoing and is looking at the different industrial corridors in Chicago, of which there are 26 and then 15 planned manufacturing districts. And so that work really kicked off with the North Branch, which was one of those opportunities to take a step back and look at the overall zoning for that industrial corridor and make changes to the zoning and then also land use based on what the vision for that community is. And that process did include multiple community resident meetings to actually talk about shaping what that vision was, so then those changes could be enacted within the zoning code itself. I think that's one way when those active planning processes occur that community residents can have input into it. So MPC has worked with some community residents and stakeholders within the Calumet Industrial Corridor to provide additional data and information via what we call the Calumet Connect data book to ground some of that planning for that industrial corridor, which is just about to kick off formally being led by the Department of Planning and Development, with data and information about more centered around environmental and public health, because I think Teresa mentioned earlier, there are some topics that have been left out of the zoning and land use conversation, I would say, in considering how we make changes to the zoning code in the past. And I think the idea is really to ground more of conversations around land use and zoning within equity and resilience, which are also two of the planning principles that's guiding the We Will Chicago citywide plan. And I don't want to go off into a tangent on that, but I do just want to say, like, there are, that was an opportunity for community-driven process to really provide data information to help shape land use and zoning planning within the industrial corridor for the Calumet. There traditionally, when you're looking at community input on zoning processes, a lot of the process is or a lot of zoning is by right. And I think there was a question in the Q&A about what by right means. My understanding of by right is based on the zoning map and ordinance. There are certain types of zoning that's just allowed that a developer can come in with a project and say, I want to do this, it conforms to the zoning in this area, and so that project is essentially allowed by right because it already conforms to what the zoning map and ordinance says. There's less community input typically in those projects. Projects that have like a zoning variance that's required or go before the plan commission typically allow more community input, but it also really varies on a ward by ward basis based on what council members, the process the council members set up in each one of the wards. So I know Uptown has a local zoning council, but not all wards have local zoning councils. So really, community input and participation is varied across the city based on what your council member permits and allows. And so I think for the Plan Commission in particular, there is a meeting that is required for all plan developments to go through the Plan Commission, and that becomes an avenue for additional community input as well, because testimony is, written testimony and spoken testimony is allowed at each one of those meetings. So that becomes, so plan developments have within them a built-in function to allow for additional community input. And that was a lot, so I'm going to pause.
Well, can I interject there, because I'll look for the link here in a second, but one of the things that I'm really, I made reference to a little while ago that I'm really proud of a change that I helped initiate, is to expand the amount of opportunity that stakeholders have to have input into the plan development process. So it isn't just one meeting anymore. That's been changed, and you know, part of what motivated me to do that is the fact, for example, that by the time, you know, let's say a developer comes in plan development and they introduce it, and they'll work with planning staff, and by the time it comes, you know, there's that one meeting, and then by the time they come before the Plan Commission, there's already several months that have passed, and there's a lot of investment in the success or the passing of this of a particular proposal. And then community have, you know, they can come before the Plan Commission and speak for 3 minutes. And then of course it goes on to the City Council, but by then so much has already happened and so much investment has been made in this. And so what I thought was really important to do was to allow the opportunity for there to be more input early on. So I'll post the link here in a minute of the document that we have developed. I want to give credit to the planning staff, especially Nancy Razovich, who worked many months, over a period of many months, and we went back and forth with her, and we had also a relatively extensive process to get input into that process that came from a number of organizations and individuals, and so we did pass that. And so now there is more opportunity for stakeholders to have input early on. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's certainly a huge improvement. And one of the things I think that it results in is encouraging the developers to sit down with community, I refer to that as different stakeholders within the community and so on, for the developers to take into account early on, before they've already invested the time and money, to really try to figure out, well, gee, I guess we could make that adjustment, or yeah, I guess we could make that change, and to sort of really hear what folks have to say and making those changes early enough in the process that they're not so invested, they're not willing to make those changes later on. So we saw that with the Michael Reese site, even though it wasn't officially adopted yet by the Plan Commission, that model was used. And I think we saw the impact in the terms of how much input went into that and how many things got taken into account that maybe otherwise wouldn't have. So I think that's a big change, and we hope that it opens doors for more stakeholder participation. I'll post a link to that document here in a second.
Thank you. So Christina sort of already alluded to by right development and when community involvement is possible with these kinds of proposed developments. But Patrick, if you could explain for everyone what the difference is between when a developer requests a zoning change or a variance or by right development.
Sure. So by right means you are taking whatever the property is, whatever its zoning designation is, and you are building whatever's allowed under the applicable chapters of the municipal code. So it can get a little, there can be nuances to that. So let's just say, for instance, I have B1 zoning, and B1 zoning is the lowest level, least intense business zoning in the city, just generally speaking. But what I want to build requires some outdoor operation. There's a very stark difference. So I could build by right in the B1, but it doesn't allow the use that I seek. So an applicant has one choice in that situation. They need to go seek a zoning map amendment. That means they'll go through, like was referenced, the corresponding public process that an alderman has. They will have to introduce an ordinance into city council. They will have to get an ordinance approved through both the Committee on Zoning and the full council to change their property from B1 in this instance to C2. Then all of a sudden they have by right zoning, because what they want to do in a C2 district is now allowed by right. So they can proceed and pull permits the very next day, for lack of a more specific timing. So by right zoning means that you're building what is allowed by right in your zoning district. However, you may need to change or seek a zoning map amendment in order to get to the by right level that is necessary for your project. So it's, there's a bit of there are some ways that the by right zoning has to include an adjustment in order to get to a new district. Now, the other aspect of that, though, is the variations and, to a degree, the special uses that are subject to review by the Zoning Board of Appeals. So let's go back to my B1 designation. Let's say that I want to build a residential building in a B1 zoning district. Well, in order to have residential on the ground floor, I would need a special use. So in order for me to do my project, I'm still in my original zoning district. I still have by right zoning, but I now need a special use from the Zoning Board of Appeals in order to actually proceed with my permits. The zoning board has to determine that the provision of ground floor residential is not out of context or character with the surrounding area of your site. That's one of the many tasks the zoning board would have. So you would have by right zoning, you would have B1 zoning, but you would need a special use in order to proceed with the project. Variations are an alternative review process through the Zoning Board of Appeals. Those no longer deal with, strictly speaking, a land use, but they deal with some relief from the applicable regulations. So that could be setback reductions, meaning you can build your property closer to the edges of your property without a setback between you and the adjacent parcels. It could allow for parking reductions. It could allow for increased building heights. There's a handful of very specific regulations that the zoning board has authority over related to variations, and that is essentially relief that you can seek in your current zoning district. So by right means you're building what is allowed under your zoning district, but sometimes in order to get to a district that allows you to build by right, you need to get a zoning map amendment. And then the last aspect is probably the most expansive on not building by right, and that would be the plan developments, which are subject to review by the Chicago Plan Commission. You still have a zoning district that precedes the establishment of your PD, but now your plan development is specifically subject to approval by the city council. So you have the least amount of certainty from a by right designation, because now you are explicitly asking the city and whatever, again, back to whatever process goes through the various wards, to review and support whatever your proposal is that is too intense to be done absent a plan development. So there are a lot of different avenues that the zoning designations might have to travel in order for your project to move ahead. But the simplest answer to by right means you don't have to do anything, you just pull a permit tomorrow. And that is a vast majority of what we see, overwhelming majority of what we see. But that doesn't mean there aren't other avenues that projects might have to move through.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, we've talked about the Lakefront Protection Ordinance and certain other ordinances, but there's these other ones like the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, the Accessory Dwelling Units, which is relatively new, as well as the transit served locations that kind of interact with the zoning code in particular ways, and they're triggered when someone requests a zoning change or something else like that. So could one of the panelists talk about how those are kind of impacting development in Chicago?
Yeah, I would like to talk about the accessory dwelling units. So this is a new law in Chicago that is actually re-legalizing a historic practice in Chicago. So the most common way that we think about accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, in Chicago is as basement units, as attic units, and more present in your neighborhood are coach houses. And so Chicago has a few thousand coach houses, and those were banned through various means like 50 years ago. And we're bringing them back. We're actually following a national trend to reallow these small units. So I'm going to show a map in just a second. So this map shows Uptown in orange or salmon colored there, and then it shows in a dashed line with a green background the ADU pilot area. So if you own a property in the ADU pilot area, a residential property, residential only property, you are allowed to build an ADU without having to go through a zoning change or without having to double check if your current zoning allows extra units. And so the pink dots, those represent locations where your neighbors have already done what the pre-application to later on apply for a permit for an ADU. And so the pre-application is basically just a double check by City Hall to ensure that you're allowed to do the ADU, so you don't have a permit problem later on down the road. And then also to double check if you have affordability requirements. So the first ADU is allowed, and if you are allowed to build a second ADU, that second one has to be rented at an affordable rate, and the affordability rate is determined by the ordinance. And so far, nobody has gotten their permit yet, but I think it's going to be really exciting when somebody does get their permit later this year. And the North pilot area is shared with North Center, with Edgewater, with Lincoln Square, and a little bit of Lakeview, I think. And that's where the most pre-applications have been submitted in Chicago. And actually, so if you go to city or chicago.gov/ADU, that's where you'll get all the details. Or if you look your address on chicagocityscape.com, it'll give you an eligibility determination.
So we have a question in the chat that kind of alludes to something I was going to bring up next. What are these other kinds of committees that a zoning change may go before? Things like historic designation or design review, and what kind of triggers those processes to take place?
So any of the other review bodies that the city has. So any committee that is not the Committee on Zoning, or any board that is not either the Chicago Plan Commission or the Zoning Board of Appeals, does not have authority over the zoning. Now, someone may have a project that is in a landmark district or is an orange or red rated building and may have some historical significance. You may be subject to review, in that case by Chicago Commission on Landmarks, whether you seek any zoning actions or not. So there's a very defined set of criteria that projects have to fall under a zoning map amendment or some of the other processes we're talking about with the Planning Commission and the Zoning Board, and those are subject to one of those three bodies that I mentioned. All of those other review authorities that the city has might very well tie into a zoning project. They may be one component of it, but they also may not have anything to do with zoning, and you may need to be subject to those other committees without having to need any zoning actions.
Can I add in something that, like, as it relates to, I think, back to stakeholder input, there are also informal advisory groups that are set up in order to provide additional feedback to the city departments or the developer. I think two examples right now would be the one for Lincoln Yards and the one for the 78, where they have neighborhood stakeholder advisory councils that are providing input on the design and the planning for those projects. So those are also other avenues where they're getting feedback from outside the official, I would say, like, city process, and then going outside to seek additional input on planning and zoning and land use changes.
Thank you, Christina. So that kind of leads into my next question of how can a community be proactive in shaping zoning and land use? And what kind of role does the community have in planning and zoning?
So I have one idea. Go ahead, Patrick.
No, it's fine. Go right ahead.
So, okay, so one idea that I have is to further your knowledge about zoning. So this panel is one thing, but just looking at a map, you can start studying like how complicated the zoning map is, and then discovering or uncovering what effects zoning has on what a neighborhood, how it tends to develop, but also how it has the ability to cause extra costs and time for small business owners. And so let's say that, so some zoning districts allow pet sales shops or pet grooming shops, but that same zoning district doesn't allow a veterinary hospital. And so if you have a business that has both, you have dog grooming as well as dog veterinary services, you would potentially have to change your zoning for the property that you want to rent out and build your vet hospital in. So that's an added cost to doing business. And so when communities think about what they want to potentially change their zoning map to look like, because they want to have exert some influence over the types of businesses that are able to open, it's consider those downstream effects on costs and complications for small business owners.
Patrick, did you want to add anything to that? Or Teresa?
Sure.
No, let's go with
Go ahead,
Patrick.
Teresa.
No, Patrick, you go ahead and then I'll pipe in.
Okay, so I was going to say, well, a couple things about that. One, every ward has potentially every ward has a unique process for reviewing zoning map amendment requests. Those are typically driven by an aldermanic office, and then the degree to which they have a variety of other parties involved depends on where it's at, how the ward is structured, how large the ward is. It's different in probably virtually every ward. But what I would say about, wanting to influence and have a say in how these things take place, one would be to participate through whichever process the alderman has. But the second thing is, and this is really where I think a lot of things are lost in the zoning world, because we have such a disparate political structure on zoning regulations, meaning each ward sometimes is handled very independently of the adjacent ward or any other ward in the city. when I say we, I mean myself and my staff, we have a lot of zoning map amendments to deal with. And the unfortunate thing is, and which I hope gets resolved to a large degree by the We Will comprehensive planning efforts of the city, is that it would be far better and more predictable and more consistent, and people could rely on it more easily and more readily if, when the zoning map is set, after an evaluation is done, in this case of a very built environment, that the zoning map then sits there. And the districts are set up to allow for an evolution of development, but they shouldn't be set up to mandate changes every month to a variety of parcels. If you open up like the zoning map, the zoning ordinance book that I carry around at work has in the back of it a page representing every square inch of the city. And these are just 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. So it's multiple hundreds of pages. And within those are all these black and white outlines of zoning designations throughout the city and the various neighborhoods. Some pages have hundreds of zoning map amendments on them over the years. And that is a very difficult situation for anybody to police from my standpoint, because how can I possibly say what's context and what's consistent? And it's also wildly unpredictable for people who live in the neighborhood, are interested in investing in the neighborhood, just want to have an idea of what their neighbor could do on their property. And so while we have a structure that allows for a lot of community input through the aldermanic offices and their zoning process, one of hopefully the benefits to come from the We Will program is to give us, give the city a new baseline to start working from. And then we can start to see how these zoning designations, when they're allowed to be grown into, can help the city evolve with some consistency and, like I was saying, predictability. But that's, absent that, which is a multi-year process, the best way to be involved is to be involved and active through your alderman's office.
So what you were saying, Patrick, is really, really interesting, because when you think about, the city hasn't had a comprehensive plan, and I'm not sure that the We Will is a comprehensive plan unless we sort of maybe push for it to be, beyond just a vision plan. But usually what you have in a comprehensive plan is this sort of idea that in this area we want to be able to allow for this, and in this area we want this to be that, and it's interesting when you have so many changes at one time. The area itself is constantly under flux, right? Which, it's interesting if we had more time to think about how that has come about in Chicago, and what that really has meant for the constant changes in the built environment and so on. And even just, then from a really super pragmatic aspect, right? What it means even for offices like yourself. So it's really interesting what you're saying, and when we juxtapose that with the good reasons for having zoning. So it's interesting. My brain is really ticking with that. What I was going to say about community participation is along the same lines that that Patrick was saying, which is, I always think about, well, what is the process? Which is why it's good, I think you guys had this forum, because you lay out what the process is. So to me, the best way to affect change is to first of all know what that process is, and then insert yourself into it and find a way to participate in shaping it. So you've mentioned the aldermanic process, but that's not the only, the only process. The other process is working directly in I think in interfacing with some of these meetings now that the developer has to have. And the developer will typically work with the aldermanic office to do that. And the two processes interface. But I think the idea is to really expand the opportunities and the ways that people can get in there and shape that. But I think part of it is one of the things that I'd like to see is expand the distance for notification. What is it now, Patrick? 250 feet or something? And so you're just getting
correct.
So then you're just getting the immediate neighbors. But what would it mean if everybody in that region? And does that help more people to know what's going on in their neighborhood? For communities to organize in these neighborhood associations is really useful. And so to be active, to know what's going on in your neighborhood. But then I think there's all these other proactive things. And so again, I mentioned I'd like to see some community input in helping to shape what is the criteria by which we should be making some of these decisions? Are there things that are left out that need to be added? And is there advocacy that can be done around that? And so, but back to the aldermanic process itself, yeah, that does involve, you know, really people being really engaged. But I think also you're going to be more effective the more knowledgeable you are, not only about the process, but about the particular development. And so one of the things that makes it difficult is a lot of times if issues get raised that maybe have to do with why you might not want something, but don't have necessarily to do with what the purview is of a land use decision. And those get difficult. So how can communities, community groups be knowledgeable enough to know how to engage in the process, I think becomes really key. So big, huge hats off to you guys for sponsoring something like this, because there's a lot of technical aspects, as you can see by everything that Patrick said.
So we're over time, but I want to, oh, did you have something, Christina?
All right, can I just add something really quickly?
Go ahead.
I mean, I think I'm hoping part of the goal of We Will Chicago is ideally a vision that's being created by stakeholders and residents and the city to think about what the city can be through a lens of both equity and resiliency as the two guiding principles. And that coming from this vision, there's more concrete steps to do more proactive planning around topics such as land use and transportation, but also some more neighborhood specific planning. Because I think there has been really good neighborhood plans that have been created by outside organizations like LISC. We participated in efforts to do it in the past as well. And I think there needs to be more general partnership with or like community organizations and groups that are working to create plans in neighborhoods, but also with the city, so that they just don't end up being plans that aren't bought in on both sides, and they don't end up just sitting on the shelf, and they actually can move towards implementation together. And I'd like to think that's going to be one of the outcomes of the We Will process too, a much stronger planning framework with stakeholders and residents and also the city, so that people, as much as possible, can be involved in shaping what the futures of their neighborhoods are. And then there's also strong support on the regulatory ordinance side to make sure that those can be implemented.
Thank you. So I had one last question, which you guys have already kind of hinted at, but what is the future of zoning in Chicago? And what are other major cities doing, and what can we look forward to in Chicago?
Going off the theme of community input, I think that Chicago needs to do a racial impact assessment of its zoning code and the zoning map. What this means is that there's a study following an already established process by Chicago United for Equity that would kind of get some residents together and start asking these structured questions of what is the impact of the existing zoning code? How do we make it less impactful to that group of people? Is any particular group of people bearing the brunt of some of these laws? I'll give an example of something that I think the zoning code, or the zoning map, not necessarily the code, so the way that the code is geographically applied, is that there are many neighborhoods in Chicago where apartment buildings are not allowed. So it's essentially a ban on apartment buildings, which in some neighborhoods can also lead to a ban on affordable housing or attainable housing, because apartments and condos are more affordable than single family detached houses. And so some neighborhoods are essentially limiting the people who can live there by quantity, by race, by class, by income, by educational status. And so that's one way that I think zoning codes and in parts of Chicago is not equitable. And that's something that we need to tackle as a city.
You know, one of the things that we really need to look at, and I'm glad that equity and resilience are themes for the We Will plan. You know, we are facing climate catastrophe, and we've really got to think about how we grow in a way that's really sensitive to climate change, not only to mitigate it, but hopefully even to slow it down. and avoid a further catastrophe. I think it'd be interesting to think creatively about what can zoning, how zoning can play a role in that, right? That's going to take some innovation to think about that. We do know, for example, that there's a lot of disproportionate impacts of some neighborhoods from industrial zoning, and as changes occur in the north side of the city, there are a lot of those industrial, the moving of industrial activity out of there. Where are they ending up? They're ending up in the southeast and the southwest sides of the city, right? And mostly predominantly Latino neighborhoods. And so there are a lot of environmental impacts of that, a lot of health impacts. So I think we need to also think about health impacts. We need to think about, and this is really an interesting thing to do, is think about what is the relationship between zoning and economic activity. Yes, we know that because of our location and because of infrastructure that's here and that's always been here, what's the relationship, for example, between this whole logistics industry, the logistics industry and its various iterations and land use. And we haven't, I know there's a task force that's recently been created, but what we need to really be thinking through some of those issues. The other one, and Jackson, you know about this because we've worked on commercial corridor plans through great cities. How do we rebuild disinvested neighborhoods? We know that Invest Southwest is doing some of that by targeting particular intersections. But how do we really rebuild those corridors? And one of the things that zoning typically has been in less so in some ways in Chicago than other cities, but the sort of the allowing mixed use development, you know, and I think we do allow a fair amount of that compared to other cities, but because a lot of times it's only single use. And so how do we allow for retail and residential as a way to activate an area, to activate a street and activate a commercial corridor and so on. But I think that you know, I'm really struck by what Patrick was saying, and I think somehow all these continual zone amendment changes to allow for changes in the area that was not necessarily designed to be that way is a really interesting thing for us to think more about in detail. And then along with that, how do we protect the lakefront? Someone started to give, that link that I sent you has some of the criteria we're supposed to consider when we're applying the Lakefront Protection Ordinance. And there's a lot of things we need to do to protect our lakefront and our natural resources. But how do we add more green spaces too in neighborhoods that don't have them? So there's other things to add, but there are other people I'm sure who can add more before we wrap up.
Patrick or Christina, any final thoughts?
Sure.
I mean, I want to co-sign.
Go ahead, Christina.
Okay. I want to co-sign most of what Stephen and Teresa said, especially around looking at doing a racial equity impact assessment as well as a public health impact assessment. I know that's one of the things that folks from the Chicago Department of Public Health and MPC is looking at doing as part of the We Will Chicago planning efforts for the zoning code in particular. And then also I just want to, like, the Lakefront Protection Ordinance is incredibly important. The Chicago River and the river system runs through more communities than the lakefront touches, and a lot of it has been zoned in the past for industrial uses. And I would like to say, like, moving into the future, really thinking about the river as a resource that isn't just only for industrial use in certain communities, but also plays a much more active role in health and recreation and ecological health as well, is something that I would also like to see. Just to note, Minneapolis also in their last plan, comprehensive plan update, got rid of single family zoning. They eliminated it entirely, as well as the parking minimum. And I am not saying that we should do anything like that, but I do think it goes back to Stephen's point about where we are allowing more density and more apartments in neighborhoods and how that also relates to equity.
I was just going to add that, you know, we're in a rather unique time, you know, in the sense that the priorities of the administration have looked at really giving us an opportunity from the zoning standpoint, from the staff standpoint, of starting to take a bigger, broader look at the impact that these regulations have both on the city and how to evolve them. There were a number of things that began under other administrations, but didn't have the the support or didn't have the political strength to move ahead that we've gotten to move through, especially in the last 2 years. The additional dwelling unit ordinance, the ADU ordinance, the air quality ordinance, which was the first of 3 steps towards addressing how our manufacturing districts are going to evolve. And again, to harken back to the planning for the We Will and the comprehensive, and I not to dwell too much on how involved the We Will plan will be, but there are essentially going to be 4 main components to the plan. One of them is hoping to involve a look comprehensively at the zoning map. Now, that will take a multi-year approach, and that's not necessarily looking at the zoning ordinance, but it's looking at the map designations and how to have designations, like I was saying earlier, fit better with the communities that they represent. And this is all a way of saying that there are many things that we're working on now for really the first time in getting to address the regulations that are in the city to be more responsive to the residents and the businesses that we want to attract. And it's a very exciting time, and opportunities like this is one of many groups I've spoken to with a presentation of this kind to talk about these ideas in various communities. It's very exciting to see people that are truly interested in what's going on in the neighborhood and how they can help impact.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Jackson, for moderating. Thank you, Christina, Stephen, and Teresa for joining us today. Again, like I mentioned earlier, some folks have degrees in this sort of thing. So an hour and 20 minutes is a very short amount of time to cover some of these issues. So there are a lot of other places that you can get resources on some of these. We'll share some of the links that were shared during this meeting, and then we'll share a recording after the meeting. But I can't thank the folks who are on here enough for their time and their expertise. We were very lucky to have such a great group of folks presenting tonight, and stay tuned for more. We'll be reaching out about our next webinars in the series in the coming weeks. And yes, Jackson?
Don't forget to mention the upcoming Clark Street planning process.
Yes, so one thing we wanted to tee up about being proactive about community plans, DPD will be launching a community planning process for Uptown's Clark Street corridor sometime in the next several months. We don't have a kickoff date yet, but watch for that. We will be sharing information on that when it comes out. And then also check out the We Will Chicago plan that Patrick and Teresa and Christina mentioned. There are ways for residents and everyone to get involved in that plan and stay up to date with that project. Again, thank you, everyone. And everyone have a good evening, and thanks for staying with us for a little extra than we had planned.
Thank you.